Okay, we're going to begin the second part of part two, looking at the history and the anatomy of race and racism. We discussed a little bit about the broadly intellectual underpinnings to race, the creation of the race, or the creation of race, and racism, looking at religion, looking at theories in science. Right now, in this portion, we're going to look at the material conditions, or you might say the socioeconomic dynamics of race and racism. You remember that when we were discussing about religion with Cain and Abel, and the curse of Ham and his descendant Canaan, that there was a relationship between the cursed individual, the cursed person, and his descendants, and the work that he and his descendants would do. So there's a relationship between the social and the economic, the person and the work. And we'll see more of this with looking at the material dynamics of race and racism. And I will emphasize that this is one area that many of us fail to look at. Many of us believe that a mere diversification in the workforce is going to solve much of the racism problems in society. It will help, but you will make very little advancement in dealing with racism, in particular systemic racism or institutional racism, without looking at the socioeconomic conditions. Now, I encourage you, please listen. Please don't dismiss this. I believe this is important. I don't hold the belief that if you recognize the truth of what I'm saying means that you're going to become some sort of leftist Marxist and you're going to abandon your faith. Don't let those status anxiety, that sort of status anxiety, keep you from really listening to the discussion that we'll have today and the discussion that others have had as well. So again, the main takeaway from this is that I want you to understand that dealing with problems of race requires an examination of material conditions and the forces of material conditions. So this is a familiar slide. You'll see that I added one portion to this. So remember, culture is a language text solidified by habits over time. Culture produces an identity by the things that we say, the things that we communicate by way of our speech and by way of our pure phenomena, that is by way of our appearance to ourselves and to others. And it's an identity that comes over time. In other words, it requires history. And it requires, to understand this requires some historical thinking. And second, remember I said that culture is the unintended consequence of our social, intellectual, and economic systems. So, if you look at antebellum, theologians who were very hostile to anti-slavery, dismissed them as traitors and treasonous and rabble-rousers, and they interpreted the curse of Ham and applied it to the existence of slaves and free blacks in America. And the more that they talked about this, the more that idea of the cursed body and the cursed slavery was sealed to the body of the African and also the African American. So let's see how race works in relation to economic systems. So the third point on this slide is something that I've had students try to memorize and to think about, to meditate on. And I would encourage listeners to meditate and think about this as well. So get this in your mind. Race is the favored idiom of the social consequences of intellectual and economic systems. Let me say it again, and you read it with me. Race is the favored idiom of the social consequences of intellectual and economic systems. Now, favored means it's just something that we are familiar with. This is the phrase of choice. Idiom is just the word that we happen to fall upon, and a word that has kind of been interwoven into our mind related to the issues that we're talking about. So it's the favored idiom of the social consequences of intellectual and economic systems. Now, I want to talk about the economic system, the social and the economic today. And the best way to do this, to look at issues of race, is let's go back to slavery. So the system of Atlantic slavery matured almost immediately following the discovery of the Americas by the Europeans. Now, there were plantations prior to the discovery of America. There was slavery prior to the discovery of the Americas. It's unclear where the term slavery comes from, but one theory is that slavery comes from the term Slav, which you would find more in Eastern Europe. Slavery was often, reserved for captives of war, those who were criminals or those who were sort of financially down on their luck. But it wasn't something that was perpetuated by, natural birth. It wasn't by, biology. For America, it wasn't until the mid to late 17th century that judges and lawyers determined that slavery would be perpetuated biologically. But that's related to a different discussion. But prior to this, we want to look at the the development of Atlantic slavery. So when Europeans discovered the West Indies in North America and Central and South America, they realized that there was plenty of land to invest in commercial agriculture. So there were commercial farms that were set up in the West Indies. Sugar was the leading crop, if you will, to crystallize the Atlantic slavery system. There were other crops like tobacco and indigo and rice and things like that. But we'll focus on sugar for right now. Now, what do I mean by commercial agriculture? Commercial agriculture is different than subsistence farming, right? Taking your land and your seed and whatever amount of labor that you have, maybe just an item of livestock and maybe a big family. You plant, you harvest, and you use that food for yourself. If there's a little bit of surplus, you can send it to the market. That's fine. But a commercial agriculture is really investing much of your time on one or two items to produce for a distant market. So this is very different from subsistence farming, and it is the beginnings of what we know as capitalism, modern capitalism. Now, if you look at something like a crop like sugar, sugar requires intense labor. It requires big machinery and a lot of labor. In fact, a lot of the sugar industries in the West Indies, the crushing process, the packaging process, looked a lot like textile industries that would, or they would serve as the model for textile industries that would then generate the Industrial Revolution. In many ways, slave or sugar plantations provided the capital necessary for the textile industry. And it's not, we're not too far away to say that slavery was vital to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. We can talk about that a little bit later, or if you have any questions that you might want to send me. Now, when you produce a mass crop like sugar, you need a lot of labor, and of course, someone who owns a factory, and that term was used during the time of, even before the Industrial Revolution. If you run a plantation, a sugar plantation in a factory like this, you always want to have cheap labor. And when you have massive amounts of labor for commercial agriculture, you always want to keep those labor costs down. And so Europeans tapped into, or they really created a market in West Africa, a market for African slaves. So Europeans, first the Portuguese, then the Spanish, and then the English and the Dutch. It was eventually the English that really dominated the Atlantic system after 1588 and after the 17th century, various wars with Spain and then the Dutch. England came to really dominate the system, and hence the reason why the Industrial Revolution began in England. So there was cheap labor in West Africa, and the Europeans would kidnap slaves and then send them to these plantations. As millions of Africans were transported across what's known as the Middle Passage, one of the most brutal, torturous, terroristic cultural transitions in world history. They came to the West Indies, they were sent to South America and North America. This cursed form of labor, slavery, was sealed to the body of the African, producing thereby a culture of degradation, a despised group. So let me say it a little bit differently. Notice the picture here. All of these Africans are going off to the West Indies, Central America, and in South America. So Africans are forced to violently to be a part of the slave system, and as a result, both the African and slavery produced the cultural identity, or part of the cultural identity that we would consider, let's say, Black or despised person, the origin of the N-word, was created because of this sort of relationship between slavery and Africans. So let me try to diagram this a little better here. Let's do this. Okay, here we have, let's say, this is, there's a little spectrum here. So remember, it's the favorite idiom of the social consequences of economic systems. So we have African on one end, and then on this end, we have slavery, right? So we have African on the one hand, you have slavery on the other hand. this arrow, let's say that this arrow represents history or time. That is the numbers, not only history, but the large numbers. So this is time sort of moving along. So on the one hand, you have African, this is the social group, and then you have slavery on the other. Now here's where culture comes. This is where, you could put it here almost. This is the social, represented by S, and this is the economic. And then what's going to evolve is the cultural, so C. So what springs from both of these is the name that we give to the, or the identity that we give, the language, the text that we give to those that come from these two systems. Black, N-word, if you want to say it, a despised group, okay? So it's from, this relationship, this very tight relationship over time that then springs up this despised group. So what is important to take into consideration, and I hope you can see it right here in this brief diagram, is that if we're going to deal with issues of race and racism, what many of Americans are doing now, a lot of Americans are trying to sympathize with the plight of African Americans and the injustices of African Americans. But if you want to do that, you must also look at socioeconomic conditions, not only the socioeconomic conditions of all African Americans, not only African Americans in the middle class, but working class African Americans. You must look at your own station, your own socioeconomic situation, whether you are of the middle class, whether you are of working class. We will make very little progress in moving closer and establishing justice if we fail to look at the dynamics of economics. It's not just ideas. It's not just attitudes. It's these almost invisible, cold, but disciplinary and often brutal forces that create our ideas. So in our next section, part 3, we will discuss systemic racism, get into a little bit more of the material conditions that have intensified slavery. And hopefully it raises awareness that while you may be upfront not conscious or explicitly racist, but you may see, I hope that you will see and understand that there is a racist system that many of us are a part of, and many of us cannot escape without confrontation. Peaceful confrontation, peaceful confronting of the machine.